Have you ever looked at a city skyline and just wondered, what are the real stories behind all that glass and steel? Not just the architecture, but the ambition, the high stakes deals, and yeah, sometimes the scandals that built it all. Well, today we're diving into the story of Rosslyn, Virginia, and how its modern skyline rose from a mix of unbelievable vision and a truly spectacular collapse. This is the story of the men who made Rosslyn. So, our story really kicks off with this number. It's the fall of 1972, and officials in Arlington County, Virginia, are scratching their heads. They're suddenly looking at a mysterious $1 million hole in their real estate tax collections. That's a huge deal, enough to throw the entire county budget into chaos. And at first, nobody could figure out why. The only clue they had was kind of weird. A bunch of the properties that hadn't paid their taxes, these shiny new office towers, were owned by corporations named after old presidents, like Millard Fillmore and Martin Van Buren. And that strange little detail, that was the loose thread that, when pulled, would unravel one of the biggest, most audacious real estate empires in Washington history. But to really get how that empire was built, we have to understand what it was built on. And let me tell you, before all the concrete and glass, Rosslyn, Virginia was a very, very different place. And listen, that is not an exaggeration. For most of its history, Rosslyn had this well-earned reputation as a grimy, crime-infested town where pretty much any illegal activity you can think of was happening, all just a stone's throw from the monuments in D.C. I mean, this detail alone tells you everything you need to know about how lawless it was. The whole area was dominated by gambling dens, seedy saloons, even floating casinos on the Potomac River. It was so dangerous that a gully near the river got the nickname Dead Man's Hollow because, yeah, bodies would just turn up there on the regular. And by the middle of the 20th century, it really hadn't cleaned up its act. It was just this sea of tacky neon signs lighting up pawn shops, loan sharks, and sketchy hotels. Everything else was basically an industrial dump, full of freight yards, junked cars, and giant oil tanks. As one planning board put it very politely, it was no credit whatever to the county. But, where most people saw this ugly, hopeless mess, three brothers saw a developer's dream. And this is where Louis, Peter, and Paul Pomponio walk onto the scene. They were the sons of a local plumbing supplier, and they had a vision for Rosslyn that nobody else could even imagine. And the change they brought was just night and day. Starting in the early 1960s, the Pomponios just started tearing down the old Rosslyn and replacing it with something totally new, a modern city of concrete, steel, and glass high-rises. They were betting everything they had on Roslyn's potential. This was the thought that was always in the head of the oldest brother, Louis Pomponio Jr. He'd been to college, but he found himself right back in the family plumbing business, hauling pipes and loading trucks at 3 a.m. He dreamed of building a small city of office buildings, and he was absolutely determined to make it a reality. And their rise was just meteoric. I mean, they put up their first building in 1960. By 1968, just 8 years later, boom, they had built 7 high-rises. That accounted for a full third of all of Roslyn's new office space. They were expanding at this absolutely breakneck pace, creating what they called new skylines. And, they lived like emperors. Their headquarters was a penthouse on the 12th floor. They had chauffeured limos. They were flying to New York 3 times a week for financing meetings, and they'd woo investors with fishing trips to the Caribbean. It really seemed like they had the Midas touch. But then came the fall. That $1 million tax issue back in '72, it wasn't just a cash flow problem. It was the first public sign that their entire $100 million empire was starting to completely fall apart from the inside. And it wasn't just one thing that brought them down. It was a perfect storm. They had built way too much, way too quickly. Inflation was sending construction costs through the roof. Bad weather was causing expensive delays, and they lost some of their key financial backers. Then, to top it all off, a federal grand jury started investigating their taxes, which scared off any new credit like the plague. The cracks started to show publicly. First, the lawsuits started rolling in. Suppliers who hadn't been paid for materials went to court. One electrical company wanted judgment for almost $250,000. Right on the heels of the lawsuits came the foreclosures. Banks and investors started seizing their flagship properties. Buildings they had just finished were suddenly being scheduled for auction on the courthouse steps. The empire was being chipped away, piece by painful piece. And then, the final blow. In September 1973, a federal grand jury indicted all three brothers and their business partner on some really serious charges: tax evasion, conspiracy, and bribery. The accusations were wild, everything from using company money on personal luxuries to bribing a bank official for loans. The legal battle that came next was an absolute quagmire. It dragged on for years, and the outcomes were all over the place. They got convicted on mail fraud, but that got reversed. The tax fraud convictions, though, those stuck. They went all the way to the Supreme Court. The bribery charges were a mixed bag, but in the end, prison time was going to happen. Years later, Louis Pomponio still maintained his innocence, and he blamed the government for their downfall. He argued that as soon as federal agents started poking around and talking to their lenders, it caused a total panic, a stampede, as he put it, that made their financial collapse totally inevitable. So how are we supposed to remember these guys? A decade after the collapse, Rosslyn's skyline was mostly built, and the Pomponio fingerprint was all over it. But their legacy is, well, it's complicated, to say the least. It really boils down to this huge contradiction. On the one hand, they were absolute visionaries. They saw incredible potential where nobody else did, and literally transformed an industrial wasteland into a modern city. But on the other hand, the way they did it led to felony convictions for tax evasion and bribery, and their whole empire ended in the complete and total bankruptcy. And maybe the most fitting symbol of their whole story, that incredible rise and spectacular fall, came in 1981 with the auction of Louis Pomponio's unfinished dream home. That $1.15 million price tag was for a 200,000 square foot mega mansion with a ballroom, an elevator, and a wine cellar that was also a bomb shelter. It was a monument to ambition that sold for a tiny fraction of what it was supposed to be worth. Today, the people who picked up the pieces of the Pomponio empire are still profiting from that original vision. The skyline the brothers created is permanent, and it leaves us with a really fascinating question, right? What is the true price of building a city? And what do we make of the complicated, messy legacies of the people who are bold enough to try?